You know, for as long as I can remember, flying cars have been this thing from sci-fi movies, right? Well, guess what? That future is practically knocking on our door, and it's happening right here in India. But here's the twist. The tech is almost there, but the real question, the one that keeps everyone up at night, isn't about the engines or the wings. It's about us. Are we actually going to fly in them? Yeah, you heard that right. We're talking about electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, or eVTOLs. Just think of them as flying taxis. And the plan is to have them zipping across major Indian cities in just a couple of years. This isn't some far-off fantasy anymore. This is a real plan for a whole new way of getting around, what they're calling urban air mobility. And this is where things get tricky. It's one thing to build these amazing flying machines, but it's a whole other thing to get people to actually, trust them and use them. So how on earth do you predict what people will do when you introduce something this new? That is the billion-dollar question that a really fascinating new study decided to tackle. Okay, so let's break this down. First things first, what are we even talking about here? This is about completely rethinking how we get around in our cities. It's called urban air mobility, or UAM for short. I want you to picture this. Instead of being stuck in gridlock, you just hail a quiet, electric flying pod to get across, say, Mumbai or Bangalore. You're literally flying over all that traffic. It sounds amazing, right? It's a huge leap forward for transport, for sure. But all of it, absolutely all of it, depends on whether we, the public, actually accept it. Which, of course, brings us right to the heart of the problem. How do you figure out if a technology is going to be a hit when it doesn't even exist in the real world yet? Look, the tech is getting there. All around the world, engineers are solving the physics problems, but the biggest question mark, the real mystery, is us. It's the human side of the equation. Because you can pour billions into engineering, build all the landing pads you want, but if people just say, nah, not for me, then the whole thing is a bust. And the old school ways of guessing what we'll do, they just don't cut it anymore. So the traditional ways of forecasting are, well, they're pretty limited for something this big. They basically take a snapshot in time and say, okay, this is what people will do. But that assumes our opinions are set in stone. And we all know that's not how it works, right? Our decisions change. They're swayed by what we see in the news, by what the government says, by what our friends are doing. So what we needed was something totally different, a dynamic simulation that could actually react to all these changes and show us a whole bunch of possible futures. And wouldn't you know it? That's exactly what these researchers built. A brand new, kind of revolutionary tool that lets us peek into the future of how people make decisions. It's called ABDIF. That's a mouthful, I know. It stands for the Adaptive Behavioral Decision Integration Framework. But here's a better way to think about it. It's not just another survey or a spreadsheet. It's more like a behavioral simulator, a digital crystal ball, if you will, that's designed to figure out how we as a society are going to react to something as game-changing as flying taxis. So you're probably wondering, how does this thing actually work? Well, this is the really clever part, the secret sauce. First, it starts with the why. It uses a proven psychological model, the theory of planned behavior, to understand our attitudes, how much social pressure we feel, that kind of stuff. Then, and this is cool, it mixes that psychology with something called behavior tree logic. This is the same kind of logic that video games use to make characters react to what you're doing. It creates all these branching what-if paths. So by blending psychology with this video game logic, you get a model that can actually simulate how our choices might change when things in the real world change. And that quote right there just nails it. We're moving away from just making one big guess about the future. Instead, we're creating a kind of living simulation that can play out thousands of different scenarios. This gives planners an incredible advantage. They can test drive their strategies before spending a single rupee. Okay, so that all sounds amazing in theory, right? But what happens when you actually put this thing to the test in the real world? Well, the researchers did just that. They fed it a ton of real-world data, and what they found, it's pretty fascinating. So, to start, they went deep. They did 40 in-depth interviews with the people who are actually going to build this industry. We're talking regulators, planners, and company execs to really get the inside story. Then they went wide. They surveyed 800 commuters across 5 major metro cities, Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, you name it. These are the people who would actually be the first customers, so their opinions are crucial. And finally, they took all of that rich data, plugged it into the ABDF simulator, and ran it 1,000 times. 1,000 different simulations, each one testing a different possible future. What if there are delays? What if there's bad press? What if the price is too high? And out of all those simulations, one finding really stood out. It's something they called the synergy effect. Here's how it works. You'd expect that having the government on board helps, right? And having positive stories in the media also helps. But what the model showed was that when you have both at the same time, something magical happens. The impact isn't just 1 + 1 = 2. It's more like 1 + 1 = 5. The combined effect is way, way more powerful than just adding the two separate parts. So what's the big takeaway here? It's that we might automatically think that the most important things are price or safety. And while those are important, of course, the model shows that the real game changers, the biggest levers for success, are getting policymakers and the public conversation aligned. It's all about coordinated policy and public perception. And this wasn't just some academic exercise. The research actually produced 4 super practical, real-world tools that planners can use right now. We're talking about things like adoption scorecards to see how ready each city is, a fair simulator to play around with pricing, and even blueprints for policy and where to build the landing pads. This is where research stops being a paper and starts becoming reality. All right, so let's zoom out for a second and look at the biggest picture here, because this is probably the most important part. This ABDF model, it's about so much more than just flying taxis. What it really does is create a whole new category of science, something you could call reactive behavioral modeling. And that gives us a powerful new playbook for how to plan for any massive technological shift in the future, whether it's self-driving cars, AI, you name it. And when you boil it all down, that's what this whole thing is about. It's about bridging that gap between the messy, unpredictable world of human minds and the nuts and bolts world of building the cities of the future. It's a way to make sure the futures we build are actually designed for the people who will live in them. Which leaves us with a pretty big question to think about, doesn't it? For the very first time, we have a tool that doesn't just predict if the tech will work, but how we will react to it. So now that we have this incredible new ability to see the human side of innovation, what should we build next?